33,984 units. That is the final production number for the Messerschmitt Bf 109. No other fighter aircraft in history reached these figures. It turned pilots into legends. The highest-scoring aces of all time flew this machine, some claiming over 300 aerial victories. By the end of the conflict, the Bf 109 had destroyed more enemy planes than any other fighter ever built. But these records came with a grim price tag. Statistics show a 90% casualty rate. 9 out of every 10 pilots who climbed into a Messerschmitt cockpit did not survive the war. The history of this aircraft is not just about engineering. It is about a machine that became a death trap for its own crews. Why did the world's most successful fighter become a flying coffin? The answer lies in its design. At first glance, a masterpiece of speed, but in reality, a deeply flawed airframe. 1919. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of its teeth. The military was capped at 100,000 men. Tanks were forbidden. Heavy artillery was banned. Most importantly, the treaty outlawed the development of modern military aviation. Production and imports of engines and parts stopped. Existing warplanes were dismantled and turned into scrap metal. The German military did not stop. They pivoted. On paper, they built civil aviation. In secret, they designed weapons of war. The national airline, Lufthansa, became a front. They operated heavy transports that mirrored the dimensions of bombers. They trained civilian pilots in navigation and flight maneuvers that were purely tactical. January 1933. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party seized control. The mask came off. The foundations for a new air force were already in place, hidden in plain sight. They needed a new fighter. The era of the wood and fabric biplane was over. The footage from the era shows the transition. Willy Messerschmitt entered the competition with a radical concept. He didn't just want a fast plane. He wanted the smallest possible airframe wrapped around the most powerful engine available. The design was aggressive. It featured a sleek, low-wing monoplane profile and retractable landing gear. It looked predatory. At the time, most air forces were still flying planes with 2 sets of wings and fixed wheels. The Bf 109 made everything else look like a relic. But this compact design created immediate problems. The cockpit was cramped. The pilot's shoulders brushed against the glass. The narrow landing gear made takeoffs and landings treacherous. One wrong move and the plane would flip. It was a machine of extremes. Events accelerated. By 1937, the Bf 109 was proving its lethality in the skies over Spain. It was the fastest, most advanced fighter in the world. But this dominance would not last. In just a few short years, the very features that made it a winner would lead to its obsolescence. The airframe was so tight that there was no room for upgrades. The world was moving forward, but the Messerschmitt was stuck in 1935. There was no turning back. 1935. The German engines were not ready. Engineers faced a crisis of timing. To get the aircraft into the air, they looked across the border. The first Messerschmitt Bf 109 flew using a British Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. It was an ironic start for a weapon designed to destroy British cities. The first prototype took flight in May. This was only 2 months after Germany officially established the Luftwaffe. On March 1st, the regime publicly renounced the Treaty of Versailles. The masks were off. The world watched in silence. Why was this aircraft a shock? Look at the competition in the early 1930s. Most fighters were remnants of the Great War. They were biplanes made of wood and fabric. They had fixed landing gear that dragged through the air. Pilots sat in open cockpits, exposed to the wind. The American Boeing P-26 was the modern standard in 1934. It was a monoplane, but the landing gear stayed down and the cockpit stayed open. The British were still flying the Gloucester Gladiator and the Hawker Fury. Both were biplanes. Both were obsolete the moment the Messerschmitt took off. The Bf 109 was a leap forward. It used an all-metal monocoque construction. This meant the metal skin carried the weight, not a heavy internal frame. The cockpit was fully enclosed. The landing gear retracted into the body. Under the hood sat a liquid-cooled inverted V12 engine. The wings featured automatic leading-edge slats. These moved on their own to improve low-speed handling and shorten takeoff runs. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's seat was reclined. This was a calculated move. It helped pilots endure higher G-forces by keeping blood in the head longer. It was a machine built for the limits of human biology. The weapons were simple at first. Two 7.92mm machine guns sat above the engine. They fired through the spinning propeller arc. A synchronization gear timed every shot. It ensured the bullets passed between the blades, so the plane did not shoot itself down. This setup provided lethal accuracy. Wing-mounted guns had to be angled to meet at a single point in space. These nose-mounted guns fired straight ahead. The stream of lead stayed tight even at long distances. The world got its first look during the 1936 Berlin Olympics. 14 pilots pushed the Bf-109 through high-speed displays. Spectators saw maneuvers that seemed impossible. It was not just a sport, it was a signal. Germany was once again a major military power. 1 year later, a modified version hit 610 kilometers per hour, a new world record. The German propaganda machine went into overdrive. They wanted the world to believe every Bf-109 was this fast. Foreign generals watched and waited. They realized their own air forces were now defenseless. But the aircraft had a secret, a design choice that killed more German pilots than enemy fire. The landing gear was attached to the fuselage, not the wings. This made the plane easier to build in separate factories. It also made the aircraft more aerodynamic, but it created a narrow, unstable stance on the ground. The wheels were too close together. Takeoff was a gamble. As the tail lifted and the propeller torque kicked in, the plane wanted to veer left. If the pilot was a second too slow, the aircraft ground looped. The narrow gear snapped. The plane flipped. There was no recovering from the veer. Roughly 1,700 aircraft were lost to landing gear accidents during the war. 10% of every Bf-109 ever built ended up as scrap on a runway. During training, 1,700 pilots died without ever seeing a combat zone. The flaw was baked into the airframe. It stayed with the Bf-109 until the very last day of the war. Thus ended the era of the biplane. Early 1937. That was the moment aerial warfare changed forever. The Bf-109 made its combat debut in the skies over Spain. The B variant arrived quietly, but its impact was loud. Germany used the Spanish Civil War as a laboratory, a live-fire testing ground for their new weapons. The pilots of the Condor Legion climbed into the cockpits and started the engines. The results were immediate. The 109 faced Soviet-supplied fighters. At the time, the Soviet planes were considered capable machines. But the German fighters shattered that illusion. It was faster. It was deadlier. It proved vastly superior in every engagement. By the time the Civil War ended in April 1939, the verdict was clear. The Bf-109 was the best fighter in the world. German pilots didn't just fly, they learned. Every dogfight provided data. The engineers back in Germany listened. The early B variants disappeared from the assembly lines. The C and D models took their place. Then came December 1938. The E model arrived. Under the cowling sat a Daimler-Benz engine, 1,000 horsepower. The sound was distinct, a low, menacing growl. Meanwhile, the rest of the world scrambled to catch up. The British Hawker Hurricane flew in 1935, the Spitfire in 1936, but they were prototypes, not squadrons. They didn't enter service until 1938. The Americans? Years behind. Their modern monoplanes wouldn't appear until the decade's bitter end. September 1st, 1939, the order was given. Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War began. The Luftwaffe unleashed a swarm. 1,000 Bf-109s were in service. 850 of them were the cutting-edge E model. Poland fell in 30 days. The resistance crumbled from the air down. Then the pattern repeated in the west. France was invaded. The footage shows Stuka dive bombers screaming, but above them, the 109s cleared the path. It simply outclassed everything it encountered. French pilots fought bravely, but bravery couldn't bridge the technical gap. May 1940. The game changed. The 109 finally met the British Spitfire, a true rival, an opponent that could fight on equal terms. Why did this matter? Because suddenly, technology wasn't enough. It came down to the man in the cockpit. At first glance, the planes were equals, but in reality, they were opposites. In a turning fight, the Spitfire won. It was agile, sharp, but the German fighter had raw power. It could outclimb and outdive the British machine. The 109 also held a secret mechanical advantage: the engine. Why did the Spitfire engine die in a dive? It was a fatal flaw in the design. The British engines used a float carburetor. Gravity was the enemy. When a British pilot pushed the stick forward, negative G-forces took over. The fuel cut off. The engine coughed and stalled momentarily. The Daimler-Benz engine had no such weakness. It used a fuel injection system. German pilots learned this quickly. They didn't turn, they dove. They hit the throttle and vanished toward the ground. The British couldn't follow without silencing their own engines. But this was only the beginning. Western Europe was under the boot of the Reich. Now, eyes turned across the Channel. The Battle of Britain loomed. 2,500 German aircraft lined the airfields of France. Mechanics welded armor plating to the 109s to protect the pilots. They rigged drop tanks to the wings. But this is where the cracks appeared. The fighter was designed as a short-range interceptor, not a long-range escort. Total range, 400 miles. That was the hard limit. Pilots took off from France. They crossed the water. They reached London. And then they looked at the fuel gauge. 15 minutes. That was all the time they had for actual combat. Any longer or any damage to the tanks and they wouldn't make it home. Time and again, the radio crackled. Return to base. German aces had to break off fights. They left bombers exposed to the wolves so they could reach the French coast. Many didn't make it. The Channel swallowed dozens of pilots who simply ran out of gas. The British also had an ace up their sleeve: radar. They could see the enemy 100 miles out. The alarm sounded. Fighter command scrambled the interceptors. The 109 pilots arrived with empty tanks. The Spitfires met them with full fuel and high motivation. Add the anti-aircraft fire from below. The sky was a kill box. By late October, the tally was grim. Germany lost over 1,700 aircraft. 600 were Bf-109s. But numbers don't explain the feeling. What was it like to fly this machine? You see, unlike the Focke-Wulf 190 or the American Thunderbolt, early fighters like the 109 had liquid-cooled inline engines. Pretty much the same thing inside a modern car. And speaking of cars, the 109 had about the same armor as a Toyota Yaris. There was bullet-resistant glass. There was plating behind the seat to stop shrapnel. But the rest of the aircraft was soft-skinned. A single bullet could end it. If a round hit the oil line, the fuel line, or the radiator, the fighter was doomed. The temperature gauge would spike. Steam would blind the windshield. The engine seized. You would be gliding toward the water. The pilot had two choices: crash land or bail out. Air-cooled fighters were robust tanks. They could fly with cylinders shot out. The 109 could not. Speed was the only armor. Maneuverability was the only shield. Inside, it was a coffin. Allied pilots later tested captured planes. Their verdict was unanimous: cramped. The cockpit was incredibly narrow. The seating position exhausted the muscles. Visibility was poor. Every inch of comfort was sacrificed for aerodynamics. The following spring brought a strange episode. Years earlier, Berlin had sold roughly 70 Bf-109s to Yugoslavia. April 1941. Hitler ordered the invasion. The Luftwaffe roared into the sky, but this time they saw familiar silhouettes rising against them. April 1941. Yugoslav pilots scrambled to defend their airspace using the exact same aircraft as their attackers. It was Messerschmitt against Messerschmitt. During the 11-day battle, Bf-109s of the Luftwaffe engaged Bf-109s of the Yugoslav Air Force in frantic dogfights. On the first day alone, Yugoslav fighters downed 7 German planes while losing 5 of their own. Chaos erupted on the ground. Yugoslav anti-aircraft gunners could not distinguish friend from foe at high altitudes. They opened fire on anything with a DB601 engine. On multiple occasions, they accidentally shot down their own pilots. The war then shifted to North Africa and the Middle East. Mechanics fitted the 109 with heavy sand filters over the air intakes to protect engines from the desert grit. This tropicalized version performed well in the heat, but the harsh terrain and extreme temperatures caused constant mechanical strain. June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. 450 Bf-109s supported the invasion of the Soviet Union. A new variant, the Friedrich, entered the fray. It incorporated lessons from the Battle of Britain. The design featured a larger propeller spinner, a streamlined engine cowling, and rounded wingtips. It abandoned wing cannons entirely. Why did they remove the wing guns? It seemed like a reduction in firepower, but in reality, it made the fighter a precision instrument. By concentrating all weapons in the nose, accuracy and handling improved. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots considered the F model the finest 109 ever built. 2 machine guns fired through the propeller arc. A single 20mm cannon fired through the hollow propeller hub. The Germans called this the Motorkanone. The ammunition was lethal. The 20mm Menengeschoss used a drawn steel construction. This allowed for thinner walls and a massive explosive payload. It didn't just punch holes, it blew aircraft apart. On the Eastern Front, the results were staggering. German pilots claimed over 4,000 Russian aircraft while losing only 150 of their own. The Soviet Air Force was a shambles. They flew outdated biplanes and early monoplanes against a professional war machine. May 1942. The Bf-109 Gustav began replacing the Friedrich. It carried a Daimler-Benz engine, producing nearly 1,500 horsepower. With over 12,000 units built, it became the most produced variant in history. It was a heavy hitter, armed with 13mm machine guns. But more power brought more problems. It got worse. Substandard metallurgy caused critical failures in exhaust valves. Engines broke down mid-flight. Some early Gustavs spontaneously combusted. Oil tanks leaked directly onto the hot engine blocks, turning cockpits into furnaces. Germany's industrial quality was collapsing. Even the best pilots weren't safe. Hauptmann Hans-Joachim Marseille was the highest-scoring ace against the Western Allies, 158 victories. He refused to fly the new Gustav, fearing the engine flaws. He only transitioned when directly ordered to do so. After scoring 7 victories in his brand new 109, his luck ran out. The footage would have shown a nightmare. Thick black smoke filled his cockpit. Marseille tried to limp back to friendly lines with his wingmen guiding him. He reached safety and prepared to jump. But the 109 had a fatal design flaw, the bailout procedure. Most fighters had sliding canopies. The 109's canopy was hinged on the right. At high speeds, the air pressure made it impossible to push open. A pilot had to pull the emergency release to jettison the entire glass frame. Then, they had to roll the plane upside down and fall out. In the blinding smoke, Marseille didn't realize his plane was in a steep dive. He was traveling at over 600 kilometers per hour. As he jumped, the slipstream slammed him backward. His chest hit the vertical stabilizer with bone-crushing force. His wingmen watched him fall to the earth. His parachute never opened. There was a dark reason behind the high kill counts of German aces. Unlike the Allies, the Luftwaffe had no rotation system. Germany suffered from a permanent shortage of trained pilots. There were no breaks. There were no leaves of absence. Every man flew until he was captured, killed, or too maimed to hold a flight stick. Even a hospital stay was temporary. As soon as a pilot could walk, he was sent back to the front. One squadron lost over 100% of its original roster. Every man was killed, his replacement was killed, and the next replacement followed. But in 1943, the mission changed completely. The hunters became the hunted. The era of easy victories was over. 1943. The sky over Germany turned black with smoke. the American and British Air Forces launched a total war on infrastructure. The target was specific: factories, fuel lines, and the Luftwaffe itself. But in the early days, this plan looked like suicide. The Allies took catastrophic losses. The footage from the era is grim. B-17 flying fortresses falling out of the sky in flames. Parachutes spotting the air. Why were they dying in such numbers? The answer lay in geography and fuel. The bombers had to strike deep into the heart of the Reich. Their targets were hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. But the Allied fighters, the bodyguards, had short legs. They escorted the heavy bombers as far as their fuel allowed. Then, the inevitable happened. The fighters banked their wings and turned back to England. The bombers flew on, alone. This was the moment the German pilots waited for. Sirens wailed across airfields in France and Germany. Pilots scrambled into their cockpits. Mechanics pulled the chocks. The Luftwaffe rose to hunt. Their goal was simple: massacre the bombers before the bombs dropped. But shooting down a B-17 was not like shooting down a fighter. The B-17 was a flying tank. It bristled with heavy machine guns. They flew in a combat box formation, creating an interlocking wall of lead. A German pilot approaching from the rear faced a storm of .50 caliber bullets. It was dangerous work. Many German fighters were chewed up and spit out by the bomber gunners. The Luftwaffe realized their standard tactics were failing. The Bf-109, their workhorse, was built for dogfights, not for taking down four-engine giants. The standard machine guns were like throwing stones at a tank. They needed heavy artillery, so the engineers went to work. They modified the 109. They bolted heavy cannons under the wings, 20 millimeters, then 30 millimeters. They added gondolas holding 135 rounds of ammunition. They even experimented with air-to-air rockets, designed to be fired into the flock of bombers from a safe distance. The firepower was devastating, but it came with a terrible price. Physics took its toll. The added weight ruined the aerodynamics. The sleek, agile fighter became a brick. It dragged through the air. The center of gravity shifted. In flight, the heavy wings made the plane swing like a pendulum. The pilot had to fight the stick just to keep it level. At first glance, a flying destroyer, but in reality, a sitting duck. These heavy 109s could kill bombers, but they could not fight other fighters. They relied on the assumption that Allied fighters would never appear over Berlin. But this was only the beginning of the end. The Allies solved the range problem. The solution wasn't a new engine or a secret weapon. It was a metal container, the drop tank. They refined the technology of external fuel tanks. They strapped them to the belly of the P-51 Mustang, and they paired this airframe with the legendary British Merlin engine. The result was instantaneous. The math changed overnight. Suddenly, Allied fighters could fly all the way to Berlin and back. The German pilots were caught off guard. They expected the escorts to turn back at the border. Instead, they saw silver Mustangs diving out of the sun deep inside Germany. The P-51 still had plenty of fuel. They roamed the skies like wolves. The footage shows Mustangs strafing airfields, parked Luftwaffe planes exploding on the ground. In the air, the slaughter was absolute. The German 109s, weighed down by heavy cannons and rockets, were sluggish. They were overloaded beasts. The Mustangs, upon seeing the enemy, simply jettisoned their drop tanks. They instantly regained full combat agility. They swarmed the heavy Germans. The Luftwaffe pilots had no chance. To make matters worse, the German war machine was breaking down. Shortages were everywhere. Fuel was scarce. Spare parts were non-existent. The planes were aging and poorly maintained. But the biggest shortage was men. German pilots were not rotated. There was no tour of duty. You flew until you were captured, crippled, or killed. The elite aces of the early war were gone, buried, or hospitalized. In their place sat teenagers, young boys with barely any flight time. They were sent up in difficult, heavy planes to fight the most seasoned Allied veterans in the world. The skies over Germany turned into a graveyard. And even if they survived the air, the planes failed them from within. There was a silent war happening on the ground. The factories were staffed by forced labor, prisoners, slaves, people who hated the regime. They couldn't shoot, so they sabotaged. A loose screw here, a handful of sand in the oil line there. Nails dropped into fuel tanks. The mechanics would check the plane, it looked fine. But at 10,000 feet, the engine would seize. The oil pressure would drop. The pilot would fall. It was invisible resistance, paid for in blood. Events accelerated. Defeat was inevitable. In the final months, desperation led to madness. The Luftwaffe formed Sonderkommando Elbe. This was a suicide squad. 300 volunteers. Their mission was identical to the Japanese kamikaze tactics in the Pacific. They took Bf-109s and stripped them. No armor, minimal guns, light and fast. The order was absolute: ram the bombers. They were told they could withdraw an hour before the mission. No record exists of anyone turning back. They climbed to altitude and aimed their fighters at the steel formations. In a single mission, 8 bombers were brought down by physical collision. There is a specific report on Heinrich Rosner. He piloted his fighter directly into the nose of a B-24 Liberator. The sound of tearing metal must have been deafening. The impact destroyed the bomber's controls. It veered violently, slamming into another nearby bomber. Both fell. Rosner didn't die. He bailed out, landing with a broken collarbone. But these were spasms of a dying animal. The Allies achieved total air superiority. The Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a fighting force. Ground troops had a grim saying in those final days: if you see a silver plane, it's American. If you see a green plane, it's British. If you see no plane at all, it's the Luftwaffe. They were correct. The statistics of the Bf-109 tell the story of industrial-scale warfare. It was the most produced fighter in history. 33,000 units rolled off the lines, 13,000 in 1944 alone. It served for 10 years. It evolved through 80 subvariants. It was a lethal machine. Bf-109 pilots shot down nearly 30,000 enemy aircraft. It created the highest-scoring aces the world has ever seen. Erich Hartmann with 352 kills, Gerhard Barkhorn with 301. 105 different pilots achieved over a century of kills. But the human cost was staggering. 90% of all German fighter pilots died. They were fed into the meat grinder until nothing remained. The Bf-109 kept flying long after the Third Reich fell. It served in foreign air forces until 1965. No other fighter has ever matched that operational lifespan. It is unlikely any ever will. The engine finally went cold. Thus ended an era.